The wedding hall was silent when Bryan Whitmore lifted his glass. Crystal chandeliers glowed above rows of polished mahogany chairs. Investors, executives, and old friends watched him with approving smiles. Bryan glanced toward the back row. There she was, Bailey Prescott, the woman he once called his wife, sitting quietly among the guests he had invited to witness his new beginning. "My past," Bryan said smoothly, raising his glass, "taught me the importance of choosing the right partner." A few guests turned to look at Bailey. His new bride, Lila Carter, followed their gaze, unaware that the quiet woman Bryan had just humiliated was the founder of the firm she worked for. And 3 minutes earlier, an email had already been sent. One that Bryan Whitmore hadn't seen yet. If you're watching this story unfold, take a moment before we begin. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. And if you believe that dignity, patience, and truth eventually speak louder than arrogance, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss stories like this. Now let's go back to where it really began. Long before Bryan Whitmore raised a champagne glass in that glittering Boston ballroom, long before the quiet humiliation he intended for Bailey Prescott, their marriage had already begun to dissolve in ways that few people around them ever noticed. From the outside, they once looked like a well-matched pair. Bryan Whitmore had the kind of presence people noticed when he entered a room. Tall, confident, and articulate, he worked in venture financing and had built a reputation among small tech startups as someone who could open doors. He understood how to talk to investors, how to present ambition in a way that sounded inevitable. People often described him as someone with momentum. Bailey Prescott was different. She did not fill rooms with energy. She absorbed them. Bailey had a habit of watching quietly while conversations unfolded around her. She rarely interrupted, rarely tried to compete for attention. When she spoke, it was usually after she had already thought through the consequences of what she was about to say. Some people mistook that quietness for uncertainty. Bryan had once mistaken it for something else entirely. They met 12 years earlier at a professional networking reception near Boston Harbor. At the time, Bailey worked as a junior analyst in corporate risk compliance, a field most people barely understood, but which quietly held enormous influence inside large companies. Her job involved identifying vulnerabilities in financial reporting, internal controls, and legal exposure. It was meticulous work. Bryan had been drawn to her that evening, not because she was the loudest person in the room, but because she was the only one who asked him questions that required real answers. He remembered it clearly. "You talk about growth like it's a straight line," Bailey had said calmly after Bryan finished describing a new startup investment. "It never is." Bryan laughed then. He liked that she challenged him without sounding combative. At that stage of his life, Bryan believed intelligence beside him made him appear even more impressive. For several years, their marriage functioned well enough. They lived in a modest apartment in Cambridge. Bryan's career began to expand as he developed connections with venture firms. Bailey advanced steadily in compliance, consulting, eventually joining a boutique advisory group that specialized in corporate governance audits. Their financial life was comfortable, but not extravagant. Bryan often talked about what would come next. Larger deals, bigger partnerships, more visibility. Bailey listened. But the first shift in their marriage came quietly. It arrived through something neither of them had planned. Bailey's mother became ill. The diagnosis came suddenly and progressed quickly. Hospital visits multiplied. Medical specialists recommended treatments that insurance only partially covered. Bailey spent weeks traveling back and forth between Boston and her hometown in upstate New York. The financial strain began to build almost immediately. Bailey never complained about it. She paid the bills that needed to be paid. She reduced her hours temporarily to help coordinate care. She quietly absorbed the exhaustion that came with balancing work responsibilities and family obligations. Bryan noticed the strain too, but Bryan interpreted it differently. Where Bailey saw responsibility, Bryan saw disruption. His professional life was entering a phase where appearances mattered more than ever. Networking dinners, investor retreats, and industry conferences began to fill his calendar. The people he wanted to impress lived inside a world where success was measured through visible markers, homes in desirable neighborhoods, carefully curated relationships, polished spouses who could move easily through social events. Bailey rarely attended those gatherings anymore, not because she refused, because Bryan stopped asking. At first, the shift was subtle. Bryan would say things like, "It's just a small dinner, mostly business," or, "You've had a long week. You should rest." Bailey accepted those explanations, but she also noticed what they meant. In time, the comments became less careful. One evening, Bryan returned from a networking event and found Bailey sitting at the kitchen table, reviewing spreadsheets related to her mother's hospital bills. "You're still dealing with that?" he asked, dropping his jacket over a chair. "Yes," Bailey replied without looking up. "There are insurance adjustments I need to verify." Bryan sighed. "Bailey, you can't carry everything forever." She finally raised her eyes. "I'm not trying to." Bryan hesitated before speaking again. "It's just that people notice things," he said, "when we're out, when conversations happen." Bailey waited. Bryan gestured vaguely around the apartment. "This situation, it changes how things look." Bailey understood the meaning behind those words immediately. But she did not respond with anger. Instead, she returned to her documents and continued reviewing them line by line. The silence between them grew longer in the months that followed. Bryan's professional circle expanded rapidly. New investors entered his life. His conversations became filled with phrases like scaling opportunities, positioning, and upward alignment. Bailey listened. She also began documenting things more carefully. Emails, financial statements, shared account transactions. Not because she suspected anything yet, but because Bailey Prescott had always believed that clarity came from records. Bryan interpreted her quietness as disengagement. In truth, Bailey was paying closer attention than ever. The moment Bryan finally suggested separating arrived on an ordinary Tuesday evening in early spring. He had rehearsed the conversation several times in his mind before walking through the apartment door. Bailey was sitting near the window with a notebook open on the coffee table. When Bryan entered, she closed the notebook gently and looked up. "We should talk," he said. Bailey nodded. Bryan spoke with the calm tone people often use when they believe they are being reasonable. "I think we've reached a point where our lives are moving in different directions." Bailey did not interrupt. Bryan continued, "You deserve a life that's simpler, less pressure." Bailey recognized the phrasing. It sounded generous, but it carried an unspoken message. "You are holding me back." Bryan leaned forward slightly. "I don't think either of us should keep forcing something that no longer works." Bailey studied him quietly. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked. Bryan exhaled slowly. "A separation, possibly divorce." He said the words carefully, like someone presenting a strategic decision rather than ending a marriage. Bailey considered the statement for several seconds. Then she nodded once. "All right." Bryan blinked. He had expected resistance, questions, emotion. Instead, Bailey simply reached for the notebook she had closed earlier. Inside were several neatly organized pages. She picked up a pen. "If that's what you want," she said calmly, "then we should make sure everything is documented properly." Bryan watched her begin writing. For the first time that evening, something unfamiliar flickered across his expression. Unease. But he dismissed it quickly. Because Bryan Whitmore believed something very firmly at that moment. He believed that Bailey Prescott was about to disappear quietly from the life he was building, and he believed that once she was gone, the rest of his future would finally move without resistance. Bailey, meanwhile, continued writing, not arguing, not pleading, just recording, as she had always done. Bryan Whitmore approached the end of his marriage the way he approached most complicated matters in life. He prepared for it, not emotionally, logistically. By the time Bryan sat down across from Bailey Prescott that evening and suggested separation, several quiet arrangements had already been made behind the scenes. A law firm in downtown Boston had reviewed the outline of a divorce agreement. A financial consultant had advised him on how to present his assets in the most efficient way. Certain transfers had already been completed. Bryan did not consider any of this dishonest. He considered it prudent. In his mind, divorce was not a failure of character. It was a restructuring. Bailey, however, approached the conversation differently. After Bryan spoke the word divorce, the apartment remained quiet for several seconds. The only sound came from the faint hum of traffic outside the window. Bailey reached for the notebook on the coffee table. She did not open it immediately. Instead, she studied Bryan with a calm, attentive expression that had always unsettled people who preferred quick reactions. "You've already spoken to a lawyer," she said. It wasn't a question. Bryan hesitated for half a second. "Yes." Bailey nodded. "That makes sense." Bryan shifted slightly in his chair. "You should speak to one as well," he added, "just so everything stays fair." Bailey opened the notebook. "I will." She wrote the date at the top of the page. Bryan watched her pen move. There was something quietly methodical about the way Bailey documented things. She wrote without rushing each line, precise and organized. Bryan had once admired that discipline. Now it made him uncomfortable. He cleared his throat. "My attorney drafted a preliminary agreement," he said, sliding a folder across the coffee table. Bailey accepted the folder. She did not open it immediately. Instead, she looked at Bryan again. "Is there anything else I should know before I read this?" Bryan leaned back. "No, it's straightforward." Bailey opened the folder. The agreement contained several sections: division of property, financial disclosures, and a proposed timeline for dissolving the marriage legally. At first glance, it appeared reasonable. But Bailey did not read documents at first glance. She read them, line by line. The room grew quiet again as Bailey studied the pages carefully. Occasionally, she underlined a sentence with her finger or paused at a paragraph longer than the others. Bryan checked his watch once. "You don't have to go through it tonight," he said. Bailey looked up briefly. "I prefer to understand things before I sign them." Bryan forced a small smile. "Of course." Bailey returned to the document. What Bryan did not realize was that Bailey Prescott had spent the last 8 years reviewing corporate compliance filings for companies many times larger and more complex than their marriage. Contracts, asset disclosures, financial reporting structures. She knew where discrepancies tended to hide. Halfway through the document, Bailey stopped at a particular clause. "Bryan," she said calmly. "Yes. This section lists your current investment accounts." Bryan nodded. "That's right." Bailey looked at the page again. "These are complete." Bryan answered immediately. "Yes." Bailey did not challenge him. She simply wrote a short note in her notebook. Bryan shifted again in his seat. "There's no need to overanalyze things," he said lightly. "This doesn't have to turn into a long legal process." Bailey closed the folder after finishing the final page. "I agree," she said. Bryan relaxed slightly. Bailey placed the folder neatly beside her notebook. "I'll need copies of several supporting documents," she continued. Bryan frowned. "What kind of documents?" "Bank statements from the past 2 years, investment account summaries, tax filings." Bryan waved a hand dismissively. "That's unnecessary. The agreement already outlines everything." Bailey met his eyes calmly. "Documentation protects both of us." Bryan paused. Then he shrugged. "Fine. I'll have my lawyer send whatever you need." Bailey nodded once. "Thank you." The conversation ended shortly afterward. Bryan left the apartment that night with a sense of relief. The entire discussion had gone smoother than he expected. There had been no dramatic arguments, no emotional scenes, no accusations. Bailey had simply accepted the reality of their separation. From Bryan's perspective, that meant the situation was under control. But several things had already begun happening quietly. The next morning, Bailey made a phone call before leaving for work. The call lasted less than 5 minutes. On the other end of the line was a Boston attorney named Daniel Harper. Daniel Harper specialized in financial litigation and asset disputes. His reputation among corporate attorneys was straightforward. He did not rush cases, but he rarely missed details. Bailey scheduled a consultation for the following afternoon. When they met, Bailey brought a small folder. Inside were copies of the preliminary divorce agreement Bryan had provided, along with notes she had written the previous evening. Daniel Harper read the document silently for several minutes. Then he looked up. "Your husband wants this finalized quickly," he said. "Yes, that's usually a sign someone prefers less scrutiny." Bailey did not respond. Daniel turned a page again. "The financial disclosure section feels compressed." "Compressed," Bailey asked. "Meaning it summarizes assets without much supporting detail." Bailey nodded slightly. "That's why I requested additional records." Daniel leaned back in his chair. That was wise. Bailey placed her notebook on the desk. "I'm not trying to create conflict," she said calmly. "I just want accuracy." Daniel Harper studied her expression. Most divorce clients arrived angry, exhausted, or emotionally overwhelmed. Bailey Prescott appeared none of those things. She looked like someone reviewing a contract. "Accuracy is reasonable," Daniel said. He closed the folder. "I'll request the financial records." Bailey thanked him and left. Over the next few weeks, documents began arriving. Bank statements, account summaries, transaction histories. Bryan's attorney sent them efficiently, assuming the process was merely procedural. Bailey reviewed each document carefully. Most of it appeared normal. Income deposits, investment activity, routine transfers. But one evening, while examining a series of older bank statements, Bailey noticed something subtle, a transfer, not large enough to stand out, but unusual. The funds had moved from one of Bryan's accounts into another entity account she did not recognize. The timing of the transfer also mattered. It occurred only 2 weeks before Bryan had first mentioned separation. Bailey wrote down the account reference number. Then she continued reviewing the rest of the documents without reacting. Several days later, a second transfer appeared. This one routed through an intermediary account. Again, the amount was modest. But Bailey had learned something important in corporate compliance work. Large financial concealments rarely begin with large movements. They begin with patterns. Bailey compiled the transactions in a spreadsheet. Dates, amounts, account identifiers. When she finished, she forwarded the file to Daniel Harper. The attorney replied the following morning. His email contained only one sentence. "We should look at this more closely." Bailey read the message. Then she closed her laptop and prepared for work. Bryan Whitmore, meanwhile, believed the divorce process was proceeding exactly as planned. From his perspective, Bailey had accepted the outcome quietly. He told friends that the separation had been mutual. He described the process as amicable, and he assumed that once the paperwork was finalized, the past would remain exactly where he intended it to stay. Behind him, what Bryan Whitmore did not understand yet was something Bailey Prescott had known for many years. Records had memory, and memory, when preserved carefully enough, eventually formed a story of its own. In the months after the separation papers were filed, Bryan Whitmore moved through Boston with the quiet confidence of a man who believed he had removed the only obstacle slowing his ascent. From his perspective, life had begun to correct itself. He relocated to a modern apartment in the Seaport District, a neighborhood that had transformed over the last decade into a polished stretch of glass towers, rooftop bars, and tech offices. The apartment overlooked the harbor with floor-to-ceiling windows and the kind of minimal design that suggested success without appearing excessive. Bryan liked the view. More importantly, other people noticed the view when they visited. His career continued to expand as well. Venture capital events, startup launches, and investment panels filled his calendar. Bryan had developed a reputation as someone who could recognize promising companies early and introduce them to the right financial networks. In those circles, stories mattered. People like to know who you were, where you came from, and why you made the choices you did. Bryan had learned how to shape his story carefully. When colleagues asked about his recent divorce, he answered with a calm tone that suggested maturity rather than resentment. Bailey and I simply wanted different things, he would say. Sometimes he added a quiet explanation. She preferred a slower life, less pressure. Occasionally, he allowed a hint of sympathy to enter his voice. It's hard when one person's ambition grows faster than the others. The implication was subtle, but effective. Bryan Whitmore had moved forward. Bailey Prescott had remained behind. The version of events circulated easily. People rarely questioned it. Bailey, meanwhile, had also moved, but not into a visible part of the city. Her new apartment was smaller than the one she and Bryan had once shared. It sat above a quiet bookstore in a narrow street in Back Bay, a place where the windows looked out onto brick buildings and tree-lined sidewalks rather than harbor views. The apartment contained only what Bailey needed: a desk, shelves filled with neatly organized files, a small dining table where she often worked late into the evening. From the outside, her life appeared modest. Bryan never returned to that street after the divorce. He assumed Bailey was rebuilding slowly, perhaps searching for stable work again, after the disruptions caused by her family's medical situation. The assumption made him comfortable. But Bailey Prescott had never been particularly interested in appearances. During the final years of her marriage, she had already begun building something quietly: a consulting firm. It started small. The firm's name was Prescott Risk Advisory. The company did not advertise widely, and Bailey rarely attended the kinds of networking events Bryan enjoyed. Instead, Prescott Risk Advisory grew through referrals inside corporate legal departments and compliance divisions. Large companies often required outside consultants to examine their internal governance systems, financial reporting, ethical oversight, regulatory exposure. Most executives disliked those audits, but they needed them. Bailey's reputation had spread slowly among legal professionals who valued accuracy over spectacle. Her firm asked difficult questions. It also protected companies from expensive mistakes. By the time Bryan moved into his Harborview apartment, Prescott Risk Advisory had already secured contracts with several regional corporations. Bailey had hired 2 analysts and a financial specialist. One of them was Monica Alvarez. Monica had joined the firm 6 months earlier after leaving a larger consulting company where she felt her work had been buried under corporate bureaucracy. She was practical, perceptive, and loyal to the quiet efficiency Bailey preferred. One afternoon, Monica stepped into Bailey's office carrying a stack of printed reports. "These are the compliance summaries for the hospitality group project," Monica said. Bailey looked up from her laptop. "Thank you." Monica placed the reports on the desk, but did not leave immediately. Instead, she studied Bailey for a moment. "You're working late again," Monica said. Bailey glanced at the clock. "I didn't notice." Monica smiled slightly. "You never do." Bailey closed the document she had been reviewing. "Is there something else?" Monica hesitated before speaking. "I saw something online earlier." Bailey waited. Monica leaned against the doorframe. "Bryan Whitmore is engaged." Bailey's expression did not change. Monica continued carefully. "The announcement was posted on social media this morning." Bailey folded her hands together on the desk. "All right." Monica raised an eyebrow. "That's your entire reaction?" "Yes." Monica exhaled softly. "You're remarkably calm about this." Bailey tilted her head slightly. "Why wouldn't I be?" Monica laughed once. "Because your ex-husband just announced his engagement less than a year after your divorce." Bailey considered that. "People move at different speeds," she said. Monica studied her for another second, trying to determine whether Bailey was suppressing emotion. But Bailey's calm did not appear forced. It looked genuine. Monica eventually nodded. "Well, the reason I mentioned it is because the company his fiancée works for just became one of our clients." That sentence finally changed Bailey's attention. "Which company?" she asked. Monica flipped open the top report. Collins Strategic Hospitality Group. Bailey recognized the name immediately. The company managed luxury corporate events for several major hotels across the Northeast. Prescott Risk Advisory had recently been hired to review their internal vendor compliance and contract transparency. Bailey reached for the report. Who is his fiancée? Monica scanned the engagement announcement on her phone. Her name is Lila Carter. Bailey's eyes paused briefly on the report's employee directory page. The name appeared there. Lila Carter, Senior Event Coordination Manager. Bailey read the line twice. Then she closed the folder. Interesting, she said quietly. Monica watched her. You know her, no? Bailey leaned back in her chair. But she works inside an organization we're auditing. Monica nodded. Yes. A small silence followed. Then Monica asked the obvious question. Does Bryan know your company's handling their compliance review? Bailey shook her head. Unlikely. Bryan had never shown interest in Bailey's professional life while they were married. He certainly had not tracked her work afterward. Monica crossed her arms. That's an unusual overlap. Bailey did not disagree, but she did not appear concerned either. Professional boundaries remain professional, Bailey said calmly. Our contract is with the company, not the individuals working there. Monica nodded slowly. I understand. But as she left the office, she glanced back once, because something about the situation felt quietly significant. Later that evening, after the office had emptied, Bailey returned to the financial documents Daniel Harper had sent earlier in the week. The attorney had begun reviewing the suspicious account transfers Bailey had identified during the divorce process. Daniel's email summary was brief. Several transactions appear routed through intermediary accounts connected to a private investment vehicle. Bailey opened the spreadsheet she had compiled earlier. The pattern had become clearer over time. Small transfers, multiple accounts. Timing aligned with the weeks leading up to Bryan's separation request. She did not jump to conclusions, but Bailey understood financial concealment well enough to recognize when money was being moved carefully. She opened a new notebook page. At the top, she wrote a single heading, Whitmore Transactions Timeline Review, underneath. She began listing dates, amounts, account references. Bryan Whitmore believed his past had been resolved. From where he stood, Bailey Prescott had quietly faded into a smaller life somewhere beyond his horizon. But Bailey was still doing what she had always done. Watching, recording, and slowly assembling the kind of story that only numbers could tell. Bryan Whitmore met Lila Carter on a Thursday evening that had been designed, like many of Bryan's evenings, to look effortless. The event took place at a rooftop reception overlooking the Charles River, one of those networking gatherings where the invitations were carefully curated, and the guest list circulated quietly among venture partners, consultants, and corporate strategists. Bryan had attended dozens of these events over the years. He knew exactly how to move through them, never stay in one conversation too long, never appear eager, always leave people feeling that speaking with him had been valuable. Lila Carter had been there for work. Collins Strategic Hospitality Group managed high-end corporate events across several major hotels in Boston. And Lila had been promoted recently to oversee strategic client relations. Her job was to ensure that investors, executives, and corporate guests experienced events that felt seamless, which meant she spent much of the evening watching details. The lighting temperature, the timing of service staff, whether guests were lingering too long at the bar instead of moving toward conversation areas. Lila had always been observant. Not in the quiet, analytical way Bailey Prescott observed things, but in the professional way someone notices atmosphere and energy. Bryan approached her while she was reviewing the event schedule on a tablet. You look like the only person here actually working, he said. Lila looked up. Bryan's voice carried the relaxed confidence she had grown used to hearing from investors. It wasn't arrogance exactly, it was practiced ease. I am working, Lila replied. Bryan smiled. That explains it. She raised an eyebrow. Explains what you look like, someone who notices things other people miss. Lila laughed softly. That's part of the job description. Bryan introduced himself. Within minutes, the conversation shifted from logistics to business to personal background in the smooth rhythm Bryan had mastered over the years. Lila found him charming. Bryan found her attentive. More importantly, Lila fit comfortably into the world Bryan was building. She understood networking events. She understood the quiet hierarchies of corporate gatherings. She also moved easily among people Bryan wanted to impress. Over the following weeks, Bryan began inviting her to dinners, gallery openings, and private investor receptions. Unlike Bailey, who often preferred quieter evenings, Lila enjoyed these environments. She knew how to dress for them, how to maintain conversations, how to leave a positive impression without appearing ambitious. Bryan liked that. It felt aligned. Gradually, Bryan began telling Lila about his past. But like most stories Bryan told in professional circles, the details were carefully arranged. My previous marriage was complicated, he said one evening while they walked along the waterfront after dinner. Lila glanced at him. You don't have to explain if you'd rather not. Bryan shook his head. No, it's fine. He paused thoughtfully. We simply wanted different lives. Lila waited. Bryan continued. Bailey preferred something quieter, less demanding. The way he spoke made the situation sound unfortunate but understandable. She struggled with the pace of my work, Bryan added. Lila nodded sympathetically. That happens sometimes. Bryan gave a small, regretful smile. I tried to make it work. What Bryan did not say was that Bailey had never once asked him to change his career, or that she had rarely objected to his professional ambitions. But Bryan believed in narrative clarity. And in his narrative, the divorce had been inevitable. Lila accepted the explanation without suspicion. She had no reason not to. Their relationship grew quickly after that. Within 6 months, Bryan was introducing Lila to his colleagues as someone special. Within 8 months, he proposed. The proposal took place during a weekend trip to Cape Cod. Bryan chose a quiet beach at sunset. He knew the moment would photograph well. Lila said yes. Friends congratulated them enthusiastically. Bryan's social media announcement appeared 2 days later. The photograph showed Lila smiling beside him, her hand lifted slightly to reveal the ring. The caption read, "Sometimes life moves you exactly where you're meant to be." Hundreds of congratulations followed. Bryan responded graciously to each one. The announcement reached many people in Boston's business circles. It also reached someone Bryan had not considered. Bailey Prescott. Bailey saw the announcement the same day Monica mentioned it in the office. She did not search for it deliberately. The post appeared when a former mutual acquaintance shared it publicly. Bailey looked at the photograph for several seconds. Bryan stood with the confident posture she remembered well. Lila Carter stood beside him, smiling warmly. Bailey recognized her immediately from the Collins Strategic Hospitality Employee Directory. For a brief moment, Bailey studied Lila's expression. She looked genuine, happy. Bailey closed the image. She did not comment. She did not react. Instead, she returned to the document Monica had left earlier that afternoon. The compliance review Prescott Risk Advisory was conducting for Collins Strategic Hospitality Group had reached an early reporting stage. Most of the audit focused on vendor contracts and internal procurement oversight. But as Bailey skimmed through the project summary again, one name continued appearing in coordination logs. Lila Carter, the woman who had just become Bryan Whitmore's fiancée. Bailey leaned back in her chair and considered the coincidence. It was not unusual for Boston's professional world to overlap in unexpected ways. Still, the alignment felt notable. Monica returned to Bailey's office the following morning carrying several folders. "Morning," she said. Bailey looked up. "Good morning." Monica placed the files on the desk. "These are the hospitality vendor disclosures from Collins." Bailey nodded. "Thank you." Monica hesitated again, clearly still thinking about the engagement news. So she said carefully, "Your ex-husband is marrying someone who works inside a company we're auditing." Bailey closed the folder she had been reading. "That appears to be the case." Monica leaned forward slightly. "You're not concerned about a conflict?" Bailey shook her head. "Our contract is with the corporation, not individual employees." "But if Bryan finds out," Bailey raised a hand gently. "Professional work doesn't change because of personal history." Monica studied her for a moment. "You're remarkably disciplined about this." Bailey smiled faintly. "Discipline is useful." Monica nodded. "All right." But before leaving, Monica asked one final question. "Did Bryan invite you to the wedding?" Bailey looked mildly surprised. "Why would he?" Monica shrugged. "Some people do that, out of politeness." Bailey thought about Bryan Whitmore. Then she gave a small, knowing smile. "If Bryan invites me," she said quietly, "it won't be out of politeness." Monica didn't ask what she meant. Later that afternoon, Bailey received an email. The sender's name made her pause. Bryan Whitmore. She opened the message. Inside was a digital invitation. Elegant, formal. The wedding would take place in 3 months at the Grand Harbor Hotel in Boston. Below the event details was a short, handwritten message Bryan had scanned into the invitation. "Bailey, I thought it would be meaningful for you to see that life moves forward for both of us. You're welcome to attend if you'd like." Bailey read the message twice. Then she closed the email slowly. Across the room, Monica looked up from her desk. "Everything okay?" Bailey considered the invitation for another moment. "Yes," she said calmly. Then she reached for the RSVP link and selected Accept. The invitation arrived on a quiet afternoon, but the intention behind it was anything but quiet. Bailey Prescott understood that immediately. The digital envelope Bryan Whitmore had sent was elegant cream-colored design gold lettering and a carefully staged photograph of the Grand Harbor Hotel ballroom where the ceremony would take place. It was the kind of invitation meant to communicate prestige before a single guest even arrived. But Bailey's attention remained on the handwritten note Bryan had attached beneath the formal details. "I thought it would be meaningful for you to see that life moves forward for both of us." Bryan Whitmore had always been careful with language. He rarely said something directly cruel. Instead, he preferred phrases that sounded polite while carrying a second meaning underneath. Bailey recognized the technique because she had spent years listening to it. Across the office, Monica Alvarez watched Bailey's expression carefully. "You didn't react," Monica said after a moment. Bailey closed the email window. "React to what?" Monica raised an eyebrow. "Your ex-husband just invited you to his wedding." Bailey folded her hands on the desk. "Yes, that's not unusual to you." Bailey tilted her head slightly. "It's unusual." Monica waited. Bailey's calm tone suggested she had already considered the situation carefully. "What do you think the invitation means?" Monica asked. Bailey did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward the large window beside her desk. Outside, Boston's afternoon traffic moved slowly along the street, the distant hum of the city filtering faintly through the glass. Then she spoke. "Bryan doesn't do symbolic gestures without purpose." Monica leaned back in the chair opposite Bailey's desk. "So what's the purpose?" Bailey turned back toward her. "To confirm the story he's told about our marriage?" Monica frowned. "What story?" Bailey answered without hesitation. "That he moved forward while I remained behind." Monica absorbed that quietly. It made sense. Bryan Whitmore operated in circles where narratives mattered. Professional reputation often depended on the version of events people believed. A wedding invitation to a former spouse could function as something else entirely. A demonstration. Monica crossed her arms. "He wants an audience." Bailey nodded slightly. "Yes," Monica sighed. "And you accepted?" Bailey's expression remained steady. "Yes." Monica stared at her. "Bailey, I know you're calm about most things, but walking into that situation seems unnecessary." Bailey reached for the notebook that rarely left her desk. She opened it to a page filled with carefully organized numbers and dates. Monica recognized the spreadsheet entries immediately. "Those are the Whitmore transactions," Monica said. Bailey nodded. Daniel Harper had continued reviewing the financial patterns Bailey had uncovered during the divorce process. The transfers between Bryan's accounts had grown more suspicious as additional banking records arrived. The amounts themselves were not enormous, but the timing told a story. Several transactions had occurred in the weeks immediately preceding Bryan's request for separation. Money had been moved through intermediary accounts connected to an investment partnership Bryan controlled. Bailey pointed to a highlighted line. This transfer occurred 11 days before Bryan asked for divorce. Monica leaned forward, and Bailey turned the page. 2 days later, another transfer moved funds into a private holding account. Monica studied the numbers. "How much are we talking about? Just under $300,000 in total?" Monica blinked. "That's not a small amount." "No. And he didn't disclose this during the divorce." Bailey shook her head. "It wasn't listed." Monica sat back slowly. "That's financial concealment." Bailey didn't argue with the statement. Instead, she continued calmly. "Daniel Harper is verifying whether the account structure qualifies as hidden assets." Monica exhaled quietly. "And if it does," Bailey closed the notebook, "then the divorce settlement can be challenged." Monica glanced at the wedding invitation, still open on Bailey's computer screen. "So Bryan is inviting you to celebrate his new marriage? Well, he may have hidden assets during the last one." Bailey did not smile, but there was a certain stillness in her voice when she answered. "Yes." Monica rubbed her temple. "Does Bryan know you've discovered this? No. Does he know Daniel Harper is reviewing the transactions?" Monica looked toward the screen again. "And he thinks you're coming to watch him start a new life." Bailey's gaze moved briefly toward the invitation. "That appears to be his expectation." Monica let out a quiet laugh that held no humor. "That's remarkable." Bailey closed the laptop. "What is the timing?" Monica gestured toward the desk. "Bryan invites you to his wedding at the same moment evidence of financial deception starts appearing." Bailey considered the observation. "Coincidences sometimes reveal structure," she said. Monica tilted her head. "You mean patterns?" Bailey nodded. "Yes." Later that evening, Bailey left the office after most of the building had emptied. Boston's streets were cooler now, the early evening air carrying the faint scent of the harbor. Streetlights reflected softly on the pavement as people moved toward restaurants, trains, and late appointments. Bailey walked slowly toward her apartment. Her thoughts were not focused on Bryan's wedding. They were focused on documents, on timelines, on the quiet discipline required to establish facts that could stand in a courtroom if necessary. When she reached her apartment, she placed her bag on the desk beside the window. The room was silent, except for the distant sound of traffic. Bailey opened her laptop again. Another email had arrived from Daniel Harper. She read it carefully. "Bailey, the financial transfers you identified warrant deeper review. The intermediary account belongs to a limited partnership tied to Bryan Whitmore's investment activities. If these funds were moved before the divorce settlement without disclosure, we may have grounds to reopen financial discovery." Bailey read the message twice. Then she opened the spreadsheet again and added several additional notes beside the transactions Daniel had mentioned. Across the city, Bryan Whitmore was having dinner with Lila Carter at a restaurant overlooking the harbor. He had chosen the location intentionally. The view was impressive. The wine list was expensive. The atmosphere suggested stability. Lila listened while Bryan described his plans for the coming year. New investments, travel opportunities, professional partnerships expanding beyond Boston. He spoke confidently about the future. At one point, Lila smiled and asked a simple question. "Do you think your ex-wife will actually come to the wedding?" Bryan lifted his glass casually. "She might. And if she does," Bryan shrugged lightly, "then she'll see that everything worked out." Lila studied him for a moment. "You're not worried it will be awkward?" Bryan smiled. Not at all. He believed that sincerely. Because in Bryan Whitmore's mind, the past had already been settled. Bailey Prescott had accepted the divorce quietly. She had disappeared from the world he now occupied. The invitation had simply been a gesture, a small reminder, a closing chapter. Bryan could not see what Bailey Prescott was still doing. He could not see the records she was assembling, the timelines she was verifying, or the legal process Daniel Harper had already begun preparing. But those things were moving forward now, slowly, carefully, and they would not be stopped by a wedding. The morning of Bryan Whitmore's wedding began with the kind of quiet order that expensive events are designed to create. Staff moved efficiently through the Grand Harbor Hotel ballroom before sunrise. Tables were arranged in perfect rows, white linen pressed flat across their surfaces. Crystal glasses caught the early light from the tall windows facing Boston Harbor. Floral arrangements, white roses and pale eucalyptus, were placed carefully along the aisle where the ceremony would begin later that afternoon. Everything had been scheduled. Everything had been rehearsed. For Bryan, the day felt like the natural continuation of a story he had been telling himself for years. A story in which ambition had eventually brought him exactly where he belonged. Bryan arrived early wearing a tailored suit that had been adjusted twice to ensure the fit was perfect. Several of his colleagues from the investment world greeted him warmly as they entered the venue. "Big day," one of them said, clapping Bryan on the shoulder. Bryan smiled. "It feels right." The phrase came easily to him. Across the hotel, Lila Carter was finishing preparations with her bridesmaids in one of the upper suites. Her wedding dress hung near the window, the morning light catching the delicate stitching along the sleeves. Lila's expression reflected a mixture of excitement and nervous anticipation. She had spent months organizing corporate events, but standing at the center of one felt very different. One of her friends adjusted the veil carefully. "You're unusually calm," the friend said. Lila laughed softly. "I organize events for a living. This feels like a project with better decorations." But even as she joked, a small thought lingered in her mind. Bryan's invitation to his former wife. She had asked about it once more the previous evening. "Do you really think she'll come?" Lila had asked. Bryan had shrugged with easy confidence. "If she does, it won't matter." Lila had nodded. But something about the situation still felt slightly unusual. Meanwhile, several blocks away, Bailey Prescott prepared for the ceremony with far less attention. Her apartment was quiet. No music played. No friends gathered around her. No excitement filled the air. Bailey stood in front of the small mirror beside her desk, fastening the clasp of a simple dark blue dress. The dress was elegant but restrained. Nothing about it demanded attention. Bailey preferred it that way. She checked the time. The ceremony would begin in less than 2 hours. On her desk, a neatly organized folder remained open beside her laptop. Inside were several printed pages, bank records, account summaries, and notes Daniel Harper had sent the night before. The financial review was still ongoing. Nothing had been filed yet, but the pattern was becoming clearer. Bailey closed the folder gently and placed it inside her bag. Then she turned off the lights and left the apartment. The Grand Harbor Hotel lobby had begun filling with guests by the time Bailey arrived. Most of them belonged to Bryan's professional world. Investment partners, startup founders, consultants. They greeted one another with enthusiastic handshakes and polite laughter, discussing markets acquisitions and upcoming deals, as if the wedding were simply another networking event with better decorations. Bailey stepped quietly through the lobby without drawing attention. Her presence blended easily into the background. She had always understood how to move through rooms without disrupting them. Inside the ballroom, ushers directed guests toward the seating rows. Bailey chose a chair near the back, not hidden, but far enough away that she would not become part of the central focus. A few minutes later, Bryan entered the room with several groomsmen. At first, he did not notice her. He was busy greeting arriving guests, shaking hands, accepting congratulations. But eventually his eyes moved across the rows of chairs, and he saw her. Bailey Prescott sat quietly in the back row, hands folded calmly in her lap. For a brief moment, Bryan paused. Then a small smile appeared on his face. She came. The confirmation pleased him more than he expected. It meant his invitation had worked exactly as intended. Several guests nearby followed Bryan's gaze. Some recognized Bailey from earlier years. A few exchanged quiet glances. None of them spoke to her. Bailey remained still. She watched the room the way she always watched unfamiliar environments, observing movement, listening to conversations, noting details. The ceremony music began softly. Guests turned their attention toward the front of the room as the wedding coordinator signaled for everyone to take their seats. Bryan stood at the front beside the officiant, posture straight, expression confident. Moments later, the doors at the far end of the aisle opened. Lila Carter entered. The room shifted instantly. The quiet conversations faded. Guests leaned slightly forward in their seats. Lila walked slowly down the aisle, her expression bright with anticipation. For a brief second, her eyes moved across the audience. They passed over familiar faces, friends, colleagues, family members. Then they reached the final row. She saw Bailey Prescott sitting quietly among the guests. Lila recognized her immediately, not from Bryan's descriptions, from work. Bailey Prescott had appeared several times in internal communications related to the compliance review Collins' Strategic Hospitality Group was currently undergoing. Lila had never met her directly, but she knew the name. Prescott Risk Advisory, the consulting firm responsible for evaluating vendor oversight across their corporate events division. Lila's steps slowed almost imperceptibly. Just for a second. Then she continued walking. Because weddings do not pause for unexpected realizations. She reached the front of the aisle where Bryan waited. The ceremony began. The officiant spoke about commitment, partnership, and shared futures. Bryan listened attentively, occasionally glancing toward Lila with the expression of someone confident about the choice he had made. Bailey remained seated quietly in the final row. Her gaze never shifted toward Bryan. Instead, she watched the ceremony with the detached patience of someone observing an event rather than participating in it. As the vows concluded and the guests applauded, Bryan allowed himself one quick glance toward the back again. Bailey was still there, still calm, still silent. To Bryan, the moment felt like confirmation. His life had moved forward. The past had taken its seat quietly behind him. What he did not realize was that several people in the room had begun noticing something else entirely. Andrew Collins had just arrived near the side entrance. As the founder of Collins' Strategic Hospitality Group, he had been delayed by a flight earlier that morning. He stepped quietly into the ballroom just as the ceremony ended. His eyes moved across the guests. Then he froze, because in the back row, sitting quietly among the observers, was someone he recognized immediately. Bailey Prescott, the woman whose firm had recently begun auditing his company's internal compliance structure. Andrew frowned slightly. Then he looked toward the front of the room. Bryan Whitmore stood beside Lila Carter, smiling as guests applauded the newly married couple. Andrew's expression changed, because suddenly the alignment between those three people in the same room felt complicated. Bailey Prescott remained seated calmly, watching, waiting. And somewhere in Bryan Whitmore's inbox, an email still remained unread. The applause inside the Grand Harbor Hotel ballroom lingered for several seconds after Bryan Whitmore and Lila Carter were pronounced husband and wife. Guests rose politely from their seats. Some lifted their phones to capture photographs. Others leaned toward one another, whispering congratulations, while the string quartet resumed playing a soft arrangement near the stage. The room moved exactly the way Bryan had imagined it would. Orderly, celebratory, admiring. Bryan turned toward the audience, his arm loosely around Lila's waist. The confidence in his posture suggested a man who believed the moment belonged entirely to him. Across the room, Bailey Prescott stood with the rest of the guests. She did not rush forward with the others gathering near the aisle. Instead, she waited calmly until the first wave of congratulations passed before moving toward the reception area that had been prepared in the adjoining hall. The reception space had been arranged with the same precision as the ceremony. Tall windows overlooked the harbor. Champagne circulated on silver trays. A stage had been prepared near the front for speeches and music later in the evening. Bailey accepted a glass of sparkling water from one of the servers and moved toward a quiet corner of the room. She did not appear uncomfortable. She simply preferred observation to participation. Several guests nearby noticed her presence. A man in a gray suit whispered quietly to the woman beside him, "Is that Bryan's ex-wife?" The woman glanced in Bailey's direction. "I think so." Neither approached her. Public curiosity rarely translates into direct conversation. Meanwhile, Bryan and Lila moved through the room greeting guests. Bryan was in his element. He shook hands, accepted compliments, and thanked people for coming. Each exchange reinforced the image he had spent months building: a successful investor entering a new chapter of life. Eventually, the reception coordinator signaled that the first round of speeches would begin. Guests gradually returned to their seats. Bryan stepped onto the stage first. He adjusted the microphone, smiling as the room settled into attentive silence. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began. His voice carried easily across the ballroom. When you look around this room, you see people who've shaped our lives in different ways. He paused briefly, allowing the statement to feel reflective. Family, friends, colleagues, mentors. Lila watched him with a warm smile. Bryan continued, "I've always believed that life teaches us through the choices we make. Sometimes we learn from success." Another pause. "And sometimes we learn from mistakes." The phrase sounded harmless on the surface. But Bryan's eyes moved briefly across the audience. They stopped at the back of the room, at Bailey Prescott. Several guests followed his glance instinctively. Bryan smiled slightly. "In my case," he continued, "those lessons eventually led me to the right partner." A soft ripple of laughter moved through the audience, not loud, not cruel, but unmistakable. Lila's smile faltered slightly. She had not expected Bryan to reference the past so directly. Across the room, Bailey remained perfectly still. Her expression did not change. She took a small sip from her glass of water. Bryan continued his speech with practiced confidence. He spoke about meeting Lila, about how her warmth and energy had brought balance into his life, about how the future finally felt aligned. The audience applauded politely when he finished. Bryan stepped down from the stage and returned to his table beside Lila. For several moments, the atmosphere returned to comfortable celebration. Then another voice rose from the side of the room, Jeff Morgan. Jeff had known Bryan for years through investment circles. He possessed the kind of personality that often mistook boldness for humor. He lifted his glass casually. "If we're telling stories tonight," Jeff said loudly enough for several nearby tables to hear, "I think Bryan deserves credit for learning when to upgrade." A few people chuckled. Jeff gestured toward Lila. "From what I hear, this marriage is a much better investment." The laughter this time was slightly louder. Not everyone joined. Some guests looked uneasy. Lila shifted in her chair. She forced a small smile, but her eyes moved briefly across the room, toward the back, where Bailey Prescott still sat quietly. Something about the moment made Lila uncomfortable. Bryan, however, appeared amused. He raised his glass toward Jeff in acknowledgement. The reception music resumed and conversations slowly returned to normal. But the tone of the room had changed subtly. At a table near the window, Andrew Collins watched the scene carefully. Andrew had entered the reception quietly earlier and taken a seat near the side of the room. As founder of Collins' Strategic Hospitality Group, he had attended hundreds of corporate events over the years. He understood the rhythm of rooms like this, and he understood when something shifted. Andrew's gaze moved from Bryan to Bailey, then to Lila. He leaned slightly toward the man sitting beside him. That woman near the back? Andrew said quietly. Yes, that's Bailey Prescott. The man frowned. Prescott, Risk Advisory. Andrew nodded. Same. The man looked surprised. What is she doing here? Andrew studied the room again. Then he said slowly, is an interesting question. Across the ballroom, Bailey's phone vibrated softly inside her bag. She glanced down. The screen displayed a new email notification. From Daniel Harper. Bailey opened the message quietly beneath the table. The email was brief. Bailey, our review is complete. She continued reading. The financial transfers Bryan Whitmore made before the divorce qualify as undisclosed assets under Massachusetts law. Bailey's eyes moved to the final paragraph. We're ready to proceed with formal action whenever you authorize it. Bailey closed the email slowly. The room around her remained filled with music, conversation, and laughter. Bryan Whitmore stood near the center of the ballroom, greeting another group of investors. Lila Carter listened politely while someone described an upcoming real estate development. Jeff Morgan ordered another drink at the bar. The celebration continued. Bailey placed the phone back inside her bag. Then she folded her hands calmly in front of her. Across the room, Bryan glanced once more toward the back tables. Bailey Prescott was still there. Still quiet, still composed. Bryan allowed himself a small sense of satisfaction. He believed the evening had unfolded exactly as he intended. The past had taken its seat quietly in the audience, and his future stood beside him. What Bryan Whitmore did not yet know was that the quiet email Bailey had just received would soon move his past back into the center of the room. Not through anger, not through confrontation, but through something far more difficult to ignore. Evidence. Long before Bryan Whitmore stood beneath the chandeliers of the Grand Harbor Hotel, before the applause and speeches and carefully staged congratulations, the decisions that would eventually reach him had already begun taking shape in far quieter places. They began in numbers. Numbers rarely raised their voices. They simply waited for someone patient enough to read them correctly. Bailey Prescott had always trusted numbers more than narratives. Stories could be rearranged. Words could soften uncomfortable truths. But numbers carried structure. When examined carefully, they revealed patterns that people often believed were invisible. The pattern in Bryan Whitmore's financial history had begun with something so small it almost looked ordinary. A transfer. $247,000 moved from one of Bryan's investment accounts into a limited partnership account registered under Whitmore Capital Holdings. The transaction had occurred 11 days before Bryan first suggested separation. At the time, Bailey had simply noted it. It was unusual, but not immediately suspicious. Venture capital investments often involved movements between accounts. But 2 days later, another transfer appeared. This time, the funds moved from Whitmore Capital Holdings into a smaller intermediary account connected to a private consulting firm Bryan occasionally used for investment structuring. The amounts were slightly smaller, but the timing aligned too closely to ignore. Bailey had documented the transfers in a spreadsheet during the early weeks of the divorce review. At that time, she had not accused Bryan of anything. She had simply recorded the information. Then she forwarded the records to Daniel Harper. Daniel Harper had spent most of his legal career examining financial disputes between business partners, investors, and former spouses. Patterns like the one Bailey identified were not unfamiliar to him. But he did not reach conclusions quickly. Instead, Daniel began requesting additional documentation through the routine discovery process of the divorce. Bank histories, investment disclosures, partnership agreements. Most of the documents Bryan's legal team provided appeared normal. But Daniel noticed something Bailey had already suspected. The intermediary account used in the second transfer had not been listed among Bryan's disclosed financial interests. Daniel sent Bailey a brief message that afternoon. There may be additional accounts connected to your husband's investment partnerships. Bailey replied with a single sentence. Please continue reviewing. Over the following weeks, Daniel traced the transactions further. The intermediary account connected to a consulting firm was only one step in the process. From there, portions of the funds had moved again. Into two separate holding accounts connected to investment vehicles Bryan managed quietly for select clients. The structure was not illegal by itself. But the timing raised questions. If Bryan had transferred marital assets into those accounts shortly before requesting divorce and failed to disclose them, those funds could qualify as concealed property. Daniel requested the partnership documents associated with those accounts. Bryan's attorney responded cautiously. Some documents were provided, others were delayed. That hesitation made Daniel more interested. Several days later, a new piece of evidence appeared unexpectedly. An audio file. It arrived as part of a routine email archive Bryan's legal team had submitted during document exchange. The recording was not labeled clearly, but Daniel listened to it anyway. Two voices spoke inside the file. One belonged to Bryan. The other belonged to a financial consultant who occasionally structured Bryan's investment partnerships. Bryan's voice sounded casual. "Just move it now," he said. The consultant responded cautiously. "That account isn't listed yet." Bryan laughed lightly. "It doesn't need to be. By the time the paperwork is finalized, everything will already be separated." There was a brief pause in the recording. Then Bryan added one more sentence. "She'll sign the agreement. Bailey doesn't fight things." Daniel replayed the audio twice. Then he forwarded it to Bailey. Bailey listened to the recording late one evening in her apartment. The room remained silent except for Bryan's voice playing through the speakers. When the recording ended, Bailey did not react immediately. She simply closed her laptop and sat quietly for several minutes. Bryan had been confident, not cruel, just certain. Certain that Bailey would accept the terms placed in front of her. Certain that she would not examine the details too closely. Certain that the version of events he preferred would become the official one. Bailey opened the laptop again and typed a brief reply to Daniel Harper. "Please confirm whether the transfers and the recording meet the threshold for asset concealment." Daniel's response arrived the following morning. "Yes. By Massachusetts law, failing to disclose marital assets during divorce proceedings could reopen financial settlements and expose the responsible party to legal consequences." Daniel explained the options clearly. They could file immediately, or they could wait. Bailey chose to wait, not out of hesitation, but because she believed timing mattered. 3 months passed. Bryan Whitmore moved forward with his life. His engagement to Lila Carter became public. Their wedding plans expanded. Guests were invited. Venues were reserved. Meanwhile, Daniel continued strengthening the documentation quietly. Bank statements were verified. Partnership agreements were examined. Transaction histories were confirmed. Every piece of evidence formed part of a growing record. Bailey did not rush the process. She understood something Bryan had forgotten. Evidence did not need to be dramatic. It only needed to be accurate. Now, inside the Grand Harbor Hotel ballroom, Bryan Whitmore laughed while speaking with several investors near the center of the room. The reception had grown louder as dinner progressed. Glasses clinked, conversations overlapped, and the music shifted into something slightly more energetic. Bryan felt comfortable again. The earlier speech had landed well. The room respected him. Even Bailey's quiet presence in the audience hadn't disrupted the atmosphere the way some might have expected. From Bryan's perspective, everything remained under control. Across the room, Bailey Prescott sat calmly at her table. Her phone rested beside her glass. She did not open Daniel Harper's email again. She had already read it. The evidence was complete. And somewhere within the digital system of Daniel Harper's law office, the documents required to begin legal proceedings were now prepared. They had not been sent yet, but they could be at any moment. Bailey lifted her glass and took another small sip of water. The music grew slightly louder. Guests began moving toward the dance floor. Lila Carter stood beside Bryan, smiling as friends encouraged them to begin the first dance. Bailey watched quietly, not with bitterness, not with satisfaction, simply with the patience she had practiced for years. Because she knew something Bryan Whitmore did not. Stories often ended differently once the records were read aloud. The music shifted as the evening moved deeper into celebration. Inside the Grand Harbor Hotel ballroom, the lighting softened slightly, casting warm reflections across the polished floor. A small space had been cleared near the stage for the first dance, and guests gathered loosely around the edges of the room with drinks in hand. Bryan Whitmore stood near the center of the dance floor beside Lila Carter. The band began playing a slow instrumental arrangement. Bryan placed one hand gently at Lila's waist, and the two of them began to move together across the floor while cameras lifted around them. Guests smiled, whispered congratulations, and recorded short videos of the newly married couple. For Bryan, the moment carried the kind of symbolic weight he appreciated. Public success, public affirmation. The room watching as his life advanced exactly the way he believed it should. Across the ballroom, Bailey Prescott remained seated. She had moved slightly closer to one of the windows overlooking the harbor, where the reflections of the city lights stretched across the water outside. From that vantage point, she could observe most of the room without becoming part of its center. Bailey watched the dance quietly, not analyzing, simply observing. The song ended to a wave of applause. Bryan kissed Lila briefly as guests clapped and the band transitioned into livelier music. Soon the dance floor filled with other couples. Conversations resumed. Waiters carried new trays of drinks between tables. Bailey remained where she was until someone approached her. "Miss Prescott." The voice was polite but uncertain. Bailey looked up. Andrew Collins stood beside her table. She recognized him immediately from corporate filings and the introductory call that had begun Prescott Risk Advisory's compliance review of Collins Strategic Hospitality Group. "Mr. Collins," Bailey said calmly. Andrew nodded. "I wasn't sure if it was you." Bailey gestured toward the empty chair across from her. "Please." Andrew sat. For a moment, he glanced across the ballroom toward the dance floor, where Bryan and Lila were speaking with guests. Then he returned his attention to Bailey. "I didn't expect to see you here tonight." Bailey's expression remained neutral. "Neither did I." Andrew studied her for a second. "Are you here in a professional capacity?" "No." Andrew nodded slowly. "I see." The two sat quietly for a moment while the music continued around them. Then Andrew spoke again. "You're aware that Lila Carter works for my company?" "Yes." "And that Prescott Risk Advisory is currently auditing our compliance structure?" "Yes." Andrew leaned back slightly in his chair. "That creates an unusual intersection." Bailey did not disagree. "Professional obligations remain separate from personal events," she said. Andrew smiled faintly. "That's a very precise answer." Bailey met his eyes calmly. "Precision is helpful in my work." Andrew nodded again. "I can see why." He hesitated briefly before adding something else. "For what it's worth, your firm's reputation is excellent. Our legal department recommended you without hesitation. Thank you." Across the room, Lila Carter noticed the two of them speaking. Her attention lingered for a moment. The name Prescott Risk Advisory had been circulating within her company for weeks during internal discussions about the compliance review. But until now, Lila had not connected that name directly to Bryan's former wife. She watched as Andrew Collins spoke with Bailey. Something about the interaction felt formal, respectful, professional. Lila leaned slightly toward Bryan. "Do you see that woman sitting near the window?" she asked quietly. Bryan glanced over his shoulder. "Yes, that's Bailey, right?" Bryan nodded casually. "Yes." Lila pointed subtly. "She's talking to Andrew Collins." Bryan followed her gaze again. For a brief moment, his expression changed, only slightly, but enough that Lila noticed. "Do they know each other?" she asked. Bryan shrugged. "I doubt it," but the answer came too quickly. Lila looked again across the room. Andrew Collins rarely initiated conversations with people he did not recognize professionally. Something about the situation felt inconsistent. Meanwhile, Andrew Collins had finished his brief conversation with Bailey. He stood and offered a polite nod. "It was good to finally meet you in person," he said. "Likewise." Andrew paused. "If our compliance review requires any additional documentation, my office will cooperate fully." Bailey nodded. "I appreciate that." Andrew walked back toward the center of the ballroom. As he passed Bryan and Lila's table, Lila greeted him warmly. "Andrew, congratulations on making it tonight," she said. Andrew smiled. "I wouldn't miss one of our team's weddings." His eyes shifted briefly toward Bryan. Then he added something carefully. "I just had the chance to speak with Bailey Prescott." Bryan's hand tightened slightly around the glass he was holding. "You know her?" Bryan asked. Andrew raised an eyebrow. You didn't realize Bryan forced a small smile. Realize what Andrew gestured subtly toward Bailey's table. "She's the founder of Prescott Risk Advisory." The sentence landed quietly, but its meaning traveled through the space between them instantly. Lila blinked. "Wait," she said slowly. "The firm conducting our compliance audit." Andrew nodded. "Yes." Bryan did not speak for several seconds. Lila looked from Andrew to Bryan. "You never mentioned that." Bryan cleared his throat. "I didn't think it was relevant." Andrew watched him carefully. In Boston, professional connections are almost always relevant. He excused himself politely after that and moved toward another group of guests. Lila remained standing beside Bryan. Her eyes moved again toward Bailey. The quiet woman near the window no longer looked like an awkward presence at the back of the room. She looked like someone who belonged to a completely different kind of authority. Lila turned back to Bryan. "You told me your ex-wife struggled financially." Bryan set his glass down on the table. "That was a long time ago, but she runs the consulting firm auditing my company." Bryan's voice hardened slightly. "That doesn't change anything tonight." Lila studied him. "You invited her here." Bryan forced another smile. It was a gesture of closure. Across the ballroom, Bailey Prescott remained seated near the window. She had watched the conversation unfold from a distance, without appearing to watch it at all. The city lights beyond the harbor reflected faintly in the glass beside her. And somewhere inside Bryan Whitmore's email inbox, Daniel Harper's prepared documents were still waiting to be delivered. Bailey reached for her phone. She did not open the screen. Not yet. But the evening had begun to change. And Bryan Whitmore could feel it. The shift in the atmosphere was subtle. Most of the guests inside the Grand Harbor Hotel ballroom did not notice it immediately. Music still filled the room, laughter still moved from table to table, and servers continued circulating with trays of wine and champagne. From a distance, the reception still looked exactly the way a wedding reception should. But Bryan Whitmore felt the difference almost instantly. It began as a quiet tightening in his chest. Andrew Collins's words repeated themselves in Bryan's mind. "She's the founder of Prescott Risk Advisory." Bryan had known Bailey worked in compliance consulting years ago. He remembered the early stages of her career, long evenings, reviewing corporate filings, quiet discussions about regulatory frameworks, the occasional frustration she expressed about executives who ignored internal risk reports. But he had never paid much attention to the details. After the divorce, Bryan had simply assumed Bailey continued working somewhere quietly. He had not imagined she had built something significant. More importantly, he had not imagined that something significant might intersect with his life again. Bryan forced his attention back to the guests around him. Lila stood beside him, her posture slightly stiffer than it had been earlier. She watched the room differently now. "Bryan," she said quietly. "Yes, you told me Bailey struggled after the divorce." Bryan lifted his glass and took a small sip of wine before answering. "She did." Lila tilted her head slightly. "But she runs the consulting firm auditing my company." Bryan set the glass down carefully. "That firm could have dozens of employees," he said. Lila studied his expression. That's not what Andrew Collins said." Bryan did not respond immediately. Across the room, Bailey Prescott sat near the window where she had been for most of the evening. She had not moved much, but she had been watching. The moment Andrew Collins approached her earlier had been expected. The compliance review her firm was conducting had placed her name on several internal documents Collins' strategic hospitality executives had reviewed in recent weeks. It was only a matter of time before someone connected the name with the person. Bailey had never attempted to hide it. She simply had not volunteered the information. Now the connection had been made, and Bryan Whitmore had noticed. Bailey reached into her bag and removed her phone. The screen illuminated quietly. Daniel Harper's earlier email still waited inside the inbox. The subject line was simple: Financial Disclosure Review. Complete. Bailey opened the message again. The summary remained exactly the same as it had been when she first read it earlier that evening. Bailey, our review confirms that the transfers Bryan Whitmore made prior to the divorce were not disclosed in the settlement documentation. Under Massachusetts law, this qualifies as concealed marital assets. Below the paragraph sat a list of attachments: bank records, partnership account structures, transaction confirmations, and the audio recording Daniel had recovered during document discovery. The message ended with one final line: We are prepared to initiate formal legal proceedings whenever you authorize. Bailey read the sentence slowly. Then she closed the message again. Across the ballroom, Bryan's phone vibrated inside the pocket of his jacket. He ignored it at first. Guests were approaching again to congratulate him and Lila. Bryan shook hands, smiled politely, and answered the same questions he had been answering all evening. How does it feel to finally be married again? Where are you two traveling for the honeymoon? Bryan handled the conversations smoothly, but the quiet tension in his chest remained. Eventually, the vibration came again. Bryan stepped slightly away from the table and removed his phone. A new email notification filled the screen. From Daniel Harper, Harper and Lowell Attorneys. Bryan frowned. The name meant nothing to him immediately, but the subject line did: Notice of Financial Disclosure Review. Bryan opened the message. The noise of the reception faded behind him as his eyes moved across the text. The message was professional, direct, and unmistakably legal. Mr. Whitmore, our office represents Miss Bailey Prescott regarding matters related to the financial disclosures made during your divorce settlement. Bryan felt the muscles in his shoulders tighten. He continued reading. Our review of financial records indicates that several asset transfers occurred prior to the finalization of your divorce agreement, which were not disclosed during the legal proceedings. Below the statement appeared a list of account numbers. Bryan recognized them immediately. Whitmore Capital Holdings, the intermediary consulting account, the partnership accounts Daniel had traced through transaction records. Bryan's pulse began to rise. The message continued. Under Massachusetts marital property law, the concealment of assets during divorce proceedings may constitute financial misrepresentation. Bryan scrolled further down. Attached to the email were documents, bank statements, transaction histories, a legal summary outlining potential actions. At the bottom of the message sat one final paragraph. Our office intends to file a petition to reopen financial discovery unless a response is received within 10 business days. Bryan stared at the screen. The ballroom noise returned around him slowly. Music, voices, laughter. None of it sounded the same anymore. Behind him, Lila noticed the change in his posture. He did not answer. She stepped closer. What is it? Bryan locked the phone screen and slipped it back into his jacket. Nothing, he said quickly, but his voice had lost the easy confidence it carried earlier. Lila studied him carefully. You just turned pale. Bryan forced a small smile. It's just work. Lila glanced toward Bailey again. Bailey remained seated near the window. Her hands rested calmly on the table in front of her. Is it about Bailey? Lila asked. Bryan exhaled slowly. It's complicated. Across the ballroom, Andrew Collins had returned to a conversation with two corporate executives. But he had also noticed Bryan checking his phone, and the sudden change in Bryan's expression. Andrew had attended enough high-level negotiations to recognize when someone had just received news they did not expect. Meanwhile, Bailey stood quietly from her table. She walked slowly toward the edge of the ballroom where the windows faced the harbor. The night outside had grown darker. City lights reflected across the water in long, steady lines. Bailey stood there for a moment. The room behind her continued celebrating. The music continued playing. Bryan Whitmore remained in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by guests who believed the evening was still unfolding exactly as planned. Bailey did not turn around. She simply waited, because now the email had been delivered, and Bryan Whitmore had finally read it. Bryan Whitmore had always believed that control came from preparation. Throughout his career, he had built deals, carefully negotiated contracts strategically, and learned how to stay ahead of problems before they could grow large enough to threaten him. But the email from Daniel Harper had done something Bryan rarely experienced. It had interrupted the story he believed he was controlling for several minutes after reading the message. Bryan moved through the ballroom, mechanically answering guests with short smiles that barely reached his eyes. He could still hear the music, still hear people laughing. But his attention kept returning to the same question. How much did Bailey know? He replayed the lines from the email in his mind. Undisclosed marital assets, financial misrepresentation. Bryan had never considered the transfers illegal. In his mind, they had simply been strategic adjustments. Money moved between investment accounts before the divorce paperwork was finalized. Nothing more. But now the language of the email framed those decisions differently. Legal, formal, dangerous. Bryan stepped away from the center of the ballroom and walked toward a quieter hallway near the restrooms. The music softened as the doors closed behind him. He removed his phone again and reopened the message. The attached documents were worse than the email itself. Bank records, transaction summaries, dates, amounts. Every detail aligned perfectly with the transfers he had made. Bryan scrolled further. Then he saw something else. The audio file. His stomach tightened. Bryan knew immediately which conversation it contained. The call with Marcus Feldman, the consultant who had helped structure the investment partnerships. Bryan had barely remembered the conversation until that moment. But the words returned clearly now. Just move it now. She'll sign the agreement. Bailey doesn't fight things. Bryan closed the phone abruptly. Footsteps approached behind him. Bryan Lila Carter stood in the hallway doorway. Her wedding dress moved slightly as she stepped toward him. "You disappeared," she said. Bryan forced a smile. "I just needed some air." Lila studied his face carefully. "You look like something's wrong." Bryan hesitated. He had always been skilled at controlling conversations, at redirecting attention. But Lila had spent years coordinating events where subtle tensions often appeared behind polished surfaces. She recognized when someone was hiding something. "Is it about the email you received?" she asked quietly. Bryan froze. "You saw that I saw your reaction." Bryan rubbed his temple. "It's a legal issue." "What kind of legal issue?" Bryan exhaled slowly. "Something related to the divorce." Lila crossed her arms. "And Bailey?" Bryan nodded reluctantly. "Yes. What exactly did the email say?" Bryan hesitated. Part of him wanted to minimize the situation, to dismiss it as a misunderstanding. But the documents he had just seen made that difficult. "They're claiming I didn't disclose certain financial accounts during the divorce." Lila's expression shifted. "You didn't," Bryan spoke quickly. "It's not that simple." "Then explain it." Bryan ran a hand through his hair. The money was moved through investment partnerships before the settlement was finalized. And Bryan looked away briefly. It wasn't listed in the final disclosure. Lila stared at him. "You hid assets during the divorce." Bryan's voice hardened. "I reorganized assets. That's not the same thing." Bryan did not respond. The silence in the hallway stretched longer. Inside the ballroom, the music shifted again, signaling the start of another dance. Lila looked back toward the ballroom doors. And she looked at Bryan again. "You invited Bailey here tonight." "Yes." And she already knew about this. Bryan didn't answer. Lila took a slow breath. "She came to this wedding knowing she had evidence against you." Bryan's jaw tightened. She didn't confront me. Lila's voice dropped slightly. She didn't have to. Back in the ballroom, Bailey Prescott remained standing near the windows overlooking the harbor. Guests continued dancing and talking around her. Only a few people noticed she had moved from her table. Andrew Collins noticed. He watched her from across the room while speaking with two corporate partners. Bailey's posture remained calm, unbothered. It was the kind of calm Andrew had seen before during negotiations when someone already knew how the outcome would unfold. Eventually, Bailey returned to her table. She checked the time on her phone. Daniel Harper had not sent another message. He didn't need to. The process had already begun. Across the ballroom, Jeff Morgan approached Bailey's table with a glass of whiskey in his hand. Jeff had enjoyed several drinks by that point in the evening. He stopped beside her chair. "You're Bailey, right?" he said casually. Bailey looked up. "Yes." Jeff smiled. "I'm Jeff. Bryan and I go way back." Bailey nodded politely. "I know." Jeff gestured toward the dance floor where Bryan and Lila had been earlier. "Interesting night for you to attend." Bailey's voice remained steady. "Bryan invited me." Jeff laughed. "Yeah, that sounds like him." Jeff leaned slightly closer. "You know, he always said you two weren't really compatible." Bailey didn't respond. Jeff continued talking. "He used to joke that you were too quiet for his world." Bailey folded her hands calmly on the table. Jeff took another sip of whiskey. "But you seem to be handling tonight pretty well." Bailey met his eyes. "I've always believed that patience is useful." Jeff raised an eyebrow, for what Bailey did not answer immediately. Instead, she glanced briefly toward the hallway doors. Bryan and Lila had just returned to the ballroom. Their conversation appeared tense. Jeff noticed the direction of her gaze. "Everything okay over there?" he asked. Bailey's expression remained neutral. "That depends on Bryan." Jeff frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Bailey stood from her chair. "I think the evening may become more complicated for him." Jeff laughed again. "That's weddings for you." Bailey picked up her bag. Jeff watched her with mild curiosity. "You leaving already?" Bailey paused beside the table. "Not yet." Across the room, Bryan Whitmore saw her standing. Their eyes met for the first time that evening. Bryan felt the weight of the email still sitting in his jacket pocket. Bailey held his gaze calmly, not accusing, not angry, simply waiting. Because now Bryan understood something he had not understood earlier that night. Bailey Prescott had not come to his wedding to witness his victory. She had come to watch the truth arrive. The reception continued. Music still flowed through the ballroom. Guests continued talking, laughing, and drifting toward the dance floor. From a distance, the evening remained what it had always been meant to be, a celebration of a new marriage. But beneath that surface, something had shifted. Bryan Whitmore could feel it every time he looked across the room. Bailey Prescott was no longer simply his former wife, sitting quietly among the guests. Now she was the person whose attorney had just accused him of financial misrepresentation. The knowledge sat heavily in Bryan's mind as he returned to the main ballroom with Lila. Several investors approached him almost immediately, eager to continue conversations that had begun earlier in the evening. Bryan answered their questions automatically. "Yes, we're planning to travel to Italy. Yes, the investment portfolio is expanding next quarter. Yes, we're looking at a few promising startups." But his attention kept drifting. Every few minutes, his eyes returned to Bailey. She stood near the windows again, speaking briefly with Andrew Collins. Bryan watched the exchange carefully. Andrew's posture was respectful, professional, the kind of posture executives used when speaking with someone whose authority they recognized. Bryan felt another quiet tightening in his chest. Lila noticed. "You're watching her," she said quietly. Bryan didn't deny it. "She's talking to your boss." Lila glanced toward the window. Andrew Collins was listening carefully while Bailey spoke. "Andrew respects people who know their work," Lila said. Bryan said nothing. A server passed by carrying glasses of champagne. Bryan accepted one without really thinking. The glass remained untouched in his hand. Across the room, Andrew Collins finished his conversation with Bailey and returned to the table, where several senior managers from Collins' Strategic Hospitality Group were seated. The conversation there shifted quickly. Andrew lowered his voice slightly. "I just spoke with Bailey Prescott," he said. One of the managers frowned. "Prescott Risk Advisory." Andrew nodded. "Yes." The manager leaned forward. "What was she doing here?" Andrew glanced toward Bryan and Lila, standing near the dance floor. "She's Bryan Whitmore's former wife." The table went quiet. Another executive spoke carefully. "That complicates things." Andrew nodded slowly. "Our compliance review is still ongoing." "Do we have any concerns?" Andrew considered the question. "No concerns about Prescott's work," he said. "If anything, their firm has been extremely thorough." Another manager looked across the ballroom. And Bryan Whitmore, Andrew's answer, was measured. "That depends on information we don't yet have." At the opposite side of the ballroom, Bailey sat once again at her table. She had spoken briefly with Andrew Collins about the progress of the compliance review. The conversation had remained professional. Andrew had not asked about Bryan. Bailey had not offered. Some matters did not belong inside a corporate audit discussion. Bailey opened her phone again. Daniel Harper had sent a short follow-up message 15 minutes earlier. "Bailey email delivery confirmed. Mr. Whitmore has opened the message. We will proceed according to your instructions." Bailey read the message once. Then she typed a reply. "Proceed as scheduled." She pressed send. Across the room, Bryan Whitmore's phone vibrated again inside his jacket pocket. He felt it immediately. For several seconds, he ignored it, but the vibration returned. Bryan stepped away from the group of guests he had been speaking with and removed the phone again. The new email came from the same sender. Harper and Lowell Attorneys. Bryan opened it quickly. The message was shorter this time. "Mr. Whitmore, as previously stated, our office will begin formal legal proceedings regarding the undisclosed financial transfers associated with your divorce settlement. You will receive official documentation within the next 48 hours. Bryan's eyes moved across the final sentence. "We advise that all relevant financial records be preserved." Bryan locked the phone screen slowly. Lila watched him. That didn't look like good news. Bryan exhaled quietly. "They're moving forward." "With what?" "A legal filing." Lila's voice lowered. "Because of the money you moved." Bryan nodded. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Lila said something Bryan had not expected. "You should have told me." Bryan frowned. "Told you what?" "The truth about the divorce." Bryan's expression hardened. "I didn't lie." Lila looked toward Bailey again. "She didn't come here tonight to embarrass you." Bryan said nothing. Lila continued. "She came because she knew this would happen." Bryan turned away. Across the ballroom, Bailey Prescott stood from her chair again. She walked slowly toward the exit of the ballroom. Andrew Collins noticed immediately. He excused himself from his table and approached her near the doorway. "Leaving already?" he asked. Bailey nodded slightly. "I have work in the morning." Andrew smiled faintly. "I suspect you always do." Bailey glanced briefly back toward the center of the room. Bryan Whitmore stood beside Lila Carter near the dance floor, speaking quietly with an anxious tension that had not existed earlier in the evening. The celebration continued around them. But Bryan's attention had already moved somewhere else. Andrew followed Bailey's gaze. "You handled tonight with remarkable composure," he said. Bailey replied calmly, "I prefer documentation to confrontation." Andrew nodded thoughtfully. "That's probably why your firm is effective." Bailey adjusted the strap of her bag. "Thank you." Andrew hesitated before asking one final question. "Will tonight affect the compliance review?" Bailey shook her head. "Professional matters remain professional." Andrew extended his hand. "I look forward to continuing our work." Bailey shook it briefly. Then she turned toward the exit. Across the ballroom, Bryan Whitmore saw her walking toward the door. Their eyes met once more across the distance. Bryan wanted to say something, to stop her, to explain. But Bailey did not pause. She simply walked out of the ballroom quietly. The door closed behind her. Inside the reception hall, the music grew louder. Guests continued dancing. Glasses continued clinking. But Bryan Whitmore knew something had already ended, and the consequences of that ending had only just begun. The ballroom continued celebrating long after Bailey Prescott stepped through the doors and into the quiet hallway beyond. Inside, the music had grown louder. Guests had moved fully onto the dance floor now, laughter rising above the rhythm of the band. Someone had ordered another round of champagne. A group of Bryan's investors had begun debating startup valuations near the bar, their voices animated and carefree. From the outside, the reception remained a success. But Bryan Whitmore could no longer hear the music the way he had earlier in the evening. His attention stayed fixed on the closed ballroom doors. Bailey had left without saying anything. No speech, no confrontation, no public accusation, just silence. And somehow that silence felt heavier than anything she could have said. Lila stood beside him, watching the room with a quiet seriousness that had not existed earlier that evening. "You should go after her," she said. Bryan blinked. "What?" "She just walked out of your wedding," Lila said calmly. Bryan exhaled slowly. What would I even say? Lila held his gaze. The truth would be a good place to start. Bryan looked away. Across the room, Jeff Morgan approached again with another drink in his hand. "Bryan," Jeff called out cheerfully, "you disappeared for a while there." Bryan forced a polite smile. "Just handling something." Jeff raised his glass. "Well, whatever it was, forget about it tonight. This is your wedding," Bryan nodded. Jeff leaned closer. "So, your ex-wife finally left?" Bryan stiffened slightly. "You noticed?" Jeff laughed. Hard not to. That whole situation was awkward. Bryan said nothing. Jeff took another sip of whiskey. "You know, I always wondered how that divorce really went." Bryan's voice sharpened slightly. "What do you mean?" Jeff shrugged. "You two split pretty quickly. No drama." Bryan forced another smile. "Sometimes that's how things go." Jeff studied him for a moment. "Sure." Jeff didn't press further. But the casual tone of the conversation left Bryan feeling even more exposed. Across the ballroom, Lila remained standing quietly. She watched the guests, watched the dance floor, watched Bryan. Her mind kept returning to the same realization. Bailey had known. She had walked into this room already aware that the legal process had begun. She had sat through Bryan's speech, through Jeff's careless jokes, through the quiet glances from guests, and she had never raised her voice once. Lila stepped closer to Bryan. "You should read the email again," she said quietly. Bryan frowned. "I already did." "No," Lila said. "Read it carefully." Bryan hesitated, but eventually he removed his phone again. The screen lit up as he opened Daniel Harper's message once more. This time, he read it slowly, not as someone trying to dismiss a problem, but as someone realizing how serious the situation had become. Every sentence was precise, every claim supported by documentation. The attachments contained records Bryan recognized immediately. Dates, transfers, account numbers. There was no exaggeration in the email, only facts. Bryan reached the end of the message and stared at the final paragraph again. "We advise that all relevant financial records be preserved." The phrase meant something very specific in legal language. It meant the investigation had already begun. Bryan lowered the phone. "They have everything," he said quietly. Lila nodded. "That's what it looks like." Bryan rubbed his forehead. "I never thought she would go this far." "Well," Lila's response came without hesitation. "You underestimated her." Bryan didn't answer, because he knew she was right. For years, Bryan had interpreted Bailey's quiet nature as passivity, as weakness. He had believed that silence meant acceptance. But Bailey Prescott had never been passive. She had simply been patient. Across the city, Bailey stepped out of the Grand Harbor Hotel and into the cool night air. The harbor stretched dark and calm beneath the lights of the waterfront buildings. A soft wind moved across the water, carrying the distant sound of traffic from nearby streets. Bailey paused near the entrance for a moment. not because she was unsure, but because the quiet felt significant after the noise of the ballroom. She checked her phone again. A new message had arrived from Daniel Harper. Documents filed with the court. Bailey read the sentence carefully. The legal process had officially begun. Bryan Whitmore would soon receive formal notice through the court system. Bailey slipped the phone back into her bag. Then she walked toward the waiting line of cars near the curb. A driver opened the door of a taxi. "Where to?" he asked. Bailey gave him her address. The car pulled away from the hotel, slowly merging into the late-night traffic along the Harbor Road. Inside the ballroom, Bryan Whitmore stood near the center of the reception hall. Guests continued celebrating around him. Music continued playing. But Bryan no longer felt part of the celebration. Lila stood beside him quietly. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Finally, Bryan said something softly. "She planned this." Lila shook her head. "No." Bryan looked at her. "What do you mean?" Lila gestured toward the ballroom. "She didn't humiliate you tonight." Bryan frowned. "She filed a legal case against me." "Yes," Lila said calmly, "but she didn't do it here." Bryan followed her gaze across the room. Bailey's chair near the window was empty now. She didn't raise her voice. Lila continued. "She didn't argue. She didn't embarrass you in front of your guests." Bryan remained silent. Lila's voice softened slightly. "She just told the truth through the proper channel." Bryan looked down at the phone in his hand. For the first time that evening, he felt the full weight of what had happened. Bailey Prescott had not come to the wedding to defeat him. She had simply allowed the truth to arrive on its own. And now Bryan Whitmore would have to face it. By the time the wedding reception ended, the city had grown quiet. The music inside the Grand Harbor Hotel had gradually faded. Guests had begun collecting coats, exchanging final congratulations, and drifting toward the elevators or the Harbor Road outside. Staff moved through the ballroom, clearing glasses and folding chairs, restoring the room to its neutral silence. Bryan Whitmore remained standing near the center of the hall long after most of the guests had left. The celebration had concluded exactly the way events like this always did, with polite smiles, lingering conversations, and the quiet dismantling of decorations that had taken weeks to arrange. But for Bryan, the evening had not ended. It had only changed direction. Across the room, Lila Carter spoke quietly with one of the event coordinators from Colin's Strategic Hospitality Group, thanking her for managing the evening smoothly. The coordinator nodded politely and gathered a few final documents before leaving. When the ballroom was almost empty, Lila walked back toward Bryan. He was still holding his phone. "You're still reading the email," she said. Bryan didn't look up. "Yes." Lila sat in the chair beside him. "Has anything changed since the last time you read it?" Bryan finally lowered the phone. "No." The words sounded heavier now, because Bryan understood something clearly. Daniel Harper's message had not been written to start an argument. It had been written to begin a legal process, and legal processes rarely reverse themselves simply because someone wished they would. Bryan rubbed his hands together slowly. "I thought the divorce was finished." Lila studied him. "You assumed it was." Bryan exhaled. "Yes." Lila's tone remained calm. But Bailey didn't. Bryan leaned back in the chair and looked around the empty ballroom. Hours earlier, this room had been filled with applause and laughter. Now it was quiet. The floral arrangements had already been removed from the tables. The dance floor lights had dimmed. Even the band equipment had disappeared. Bryan felt as if the evening had been dismantled piece by piece. "I didn't think she would challenge it," he said quietly. Lila didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked toward the tall windows where Bailey had stood earlier in the night. "She didn't challenge it," Lila said. Bryan frowned. "What do you mean? She documented it." Bryan remained silent. Lila continued. "That's very different." Bryan knew she was right. During their marriage, Bailey had rarely raised her voice, rarely argued, rarely tried to win disagreements through force of personality. Instead, she listened. She observed, and she recorded things carefully. At the time, Bryan had interpreted that behavior as withdrawal. Now he realized it had been discipline. Across the city, Bailey Prescott unlocked the door to her apartment and stepped inside. The quiet of the room welcomed her, the way quiet places always had. She placed her bag on the desk near the window and removed the folder containing the printed documents Daniel Harper had prepared earlier. The folder was thicker now. Court filings, transaction records, partnership agreements. Everything required to reopen the financial settlement had been organized carefully. Bailey placed the folder beside her laptop. For a few minutes, she simply stood by the window, looking out at the dim lights of the city. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel anger. Mostly, she felt something simpler. Completion. After a moment, she opened her laptop. A new email had already arrived from Daniel Harper. "Bailey, the petition has been filed with the court. Mr. Whitmore will receive official notice shortly. Our office will handle all further communication." Bailey read the message slowly. Then she replied, "Thank you." She closed the laptop and turned off the desk lamp. The room returned to darkness, except for the faint glow of the city outside. Back at the hotel, Bryan and Lila walked slowly toward the exit. The staff had begun shutting down the ballroom behind them. In the lobby, a few remaining guests waited for cars. Jeff Morgan waved lazily from across the room. "Bryan," he called. "Great wedding man." Bryan nodded politely. "Thanks for coming." Jeff laughed. "Don't look so serious. You're married now. That's supposed to be the happy part." Bryan forced a faint smile. Jeff eventually left, leaving Bryan and Lila alone in the quiet lobby. The doors opened as a cold breeze drifted in from the harbor. The car pulled up to the curb. Lila looked at Bryan. "What happens next?" she asked. Bryan took a slow breath. "I talked to a lawyer." Lila nodded. "That sounds wise." Bryan glanced toward the harbor lights. "Bailey always believed in records," he said quietly. Lila folded her arms. "And now the records are speaking." Bryan didn't answer, because there was nothing left to argue with. Across the city, Bailey Prescott prepared for bed. The wedding had ended. The legal process had begun. And tomorrow would look very similar to the day before. She would return to the office, continue the compliance review for Collins Strategic Hospitality Group, answer emails, examine documents, the same work she had always done. Bryan Whitmore's life would continue as well. But the version of the past he believed he had closed would now be examined again. Not in a ballroom, not through speeches or accusations, but through records, through law, through evidence. Bailey turned off the final light in her apartment. Outside, Boston's skyline stood quietly against the night sky. And somewhere within the city's legal system, the truth Bryan Whitmore thought he had buried was beginning to move forward slowly, methodically, and with the same quiet patience Bailey Prescott had carried all along. The quietest victories rarely happen in crowded rooms. They don't arrive with applause or public humiliation. They don't need speeches, arguments, or dramatic confrontations. Instead, they unfold slowly through disciplined patience and the quiet belief that truth eventually finds its way into the light. Bailey Prescott never raised her voice that night. She didn't interrupt the wedding. She didn't embarrass Bryan Whitmore in front of his guests. She simply allowed the truth to move through the proper channels the same way she had handled every difficult moment in her life. Carefully, precisely, and with dignity. And sometimes, dignity is the most powerful answer a person can give. Bryan believed success meant moving faster than the past could catch him. Bailey believed something different. She believed that if you kept your records straight, your work honest, and your patience steady, the truth would eventually speak for itself. If this story made you think about the quiet strength people carry when they refuse to be defined by someone else's version of the past, feel free to share your thoughts. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if stories about dignity, patience, and justice resonate with you, you're always welcome to follow along for the next one. Sometimes the strongest stories are not about revenge. They're about walking away with your integrity still intact.